Well, super excited to be here in front of this group today. So I appreciate all of your time and attention. Um, as you just heard, we're going to be speaking about producing quality soft-red winter wheat for both millers and manufacturers to understand what your end users, not just mills, but what the end use manufacturers are really looking for in quality soft-red winter wheat. So I'm going to start with just a brief company overview. I know some of you may be familiar with the Andersons, but there may be others that aren't so familiar. So just starting with our mission and statement of principles, I mean, I find generally that we're a very service-oriented company, whether that's working with customers like yourselves or end users, or getting out in the community and doing similar things. Company has been around since 1947, so it was run as a family-owned business for almost 50 years before it went public in 1996. We've got a couple thousand employees today, about a couple hundred facilities, and we're a top 10 player in most of the segments within or in which we operate. So today, those two primary business segments are divided into agribusiness and renewables. So the renewable segment really is focused on biofuels and ethanol production. And then the agribusiness segment, which Sam and I both sit in, really focus on ag supply chain from fertilizer and nutrition programs to grain marketing services. Within the agribusiness segment, we handle very large volumes of soft red winter wheat. The Andersons has a long history of handling that commodity. So like I said, that's the group that Sam and I both sit in today. And we are very focused on a specialty and organic mill within Hudson. But I think, we're getting more involved in conventional soft red wheat, and we work with a lot of our other business groups that handle that commodity as well. So just looking at a footprint of where we operate, really all over the United States today. The Andersons started in Ohio, so a lot of our grain elevators are in that area. We've recently expanded out further west, most recently acquiring a bunch of grain elevators throughout Colorado, Kansas, and Texas. And then we've also really expanded our international presence in the last 5 years or so with offices in several different countries. So diving into end use applications and what our customers are expecting and just trends in the space in general. I think this is a very important topic because we really ideally want to be in this win-win scenario where we see grain that's hitting the scales, that's quality, meets the quality expectations for us, for our end users, and also keeps more money in your pockets. Because I know everybody looks straight to that discount line when they get paid once they've delivered grain, and we want to help minimize any discounts that are seen once you're delivering grain to one of our facilities or elsewhere. And so I think understanding that market demand is really what drives profitability is important. So there's lots of trends in the space that are ultimately going to dictate what customers and the manufacturers and the millers and other processors and blenders are looking for in their grain. So knowing your buyer and what their expectations are, I think are really going to help avoid those discounts. And also understanding that quality starts on the farm. So, we just heard from Albert Lee, obviously being a seed supplier, extremely important in terms of what you're selecting and putting in your fields. So common end use applications for soft red winter wheat. I'm sure a lot of you guys already know this, but soft red winter wheat, a lot of it is grown in the Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, surrounding areas, some on the East Coast as well, some further out west, although a lot of that ends up being harder wheat production. But soft red winter wheat specifically is often used in products where you really want a nice soft texture. So cookies, crackers, pastries, cakes, flatbreads. We've seen a lot of demand for it recently in the pet space as well. It's also used widely in livestock feed and in some more industrial applications. Again, low protein, soft texture. It's ideal for that tenderness in the product. It has ideal starch properties. It's very digestible and has ideal processing performance too once it hits a mill. So looking more closely at pet food, because this is one where we definitely see in more and more demand, and also demand for very high quality wheat. Again, it's used for its digestible properties and for extrusion properties. It's very cost effective. Pet food manufacturers generally are looking for the same things that food manufacturers are looking for: consistent quality, reliable texture, so that their finished product has reliable texture and shape. Again, soft red wheat has the right starch content and texture to support the needs of those manufacturers. So looking more widely at some industry trends that are shaping this space today, um, again, buyers, pet food manufacturers, they're asking more and more about how the wheat is grown, not just what it looks like, not just what the specifications are physically. So we see more and more conversation and demand for sustainable, low input practices. You hear the term regenerative agriculture a lot gaining attention. I mean, sometimes we're seeing premiums in the space for that. I think that's one thing that the space in general is still trying to sort out. Like, consumers are looking for all of these things, but what exactly is the tolerance to pay a premium to help get there? We're also starting to see some more discussion around heavy metals and pesticide residue testing. So these are all themes and trends that we expect to continue to hear about moving forward. So, talking a little bit more about what food and pet food manufacturers are valuing, they certainly want a clean grain so that it leads to a nice, clean milled flour. That involves low foreign material coming into the facility. They're looking for low levels of toxins, vomitoxin and zearalenone in particular are concerns for wheat. They're looking for that stable quality. Again, if they're using it in extrusion capacity, certainly consistent physical qualities, and then minimum kernel damage. I mean, we all know that any sprout or damage with wheat kernels can be really detrimental to not only you delivering grain to a facility, but its performance all the way through to the finished product. Like I said, we've been more involved in the pet food space as of late. We recently had an internal meeting where I thought it was kind of interesting, because I go to all these events and conferences where people kind of joke about how some of the specifications for pet food seem to be even more aggressive or tight, as compared to human food. And so, someone in our meeting asked, like, well, why is that? Like, why do we sometimes see even lower toxin limits for pet food specifications than we do for human food? And I thought it was interesting the explanation that we heard because, of course, toxins are a concern in any ingredient, but humans tend to eat a way more varied diet. So if you're inadvertently exposed to a higher toxin, typically it's going to be in, maybe one thing that you ate of many that day. But in pet food, since we tend to feed our pets the same meal every single day, and they come in very large bags, so they could be eating the same food or the same lot for months at a time. So that repeat exposure, they're a bit more susceptible to elevated toxin levels. And so there's been a lot more scrutiny and attention to toxins in pet food ingredients as of late. And I really expect that we'll continue to see that trend evolve. So looking at general milling and end use quality requirements, these probably aren't new to anybody on this call, but I think the important thing here is that these are general and you want to know your buyer and your end user to see if there's anything additional or anything that differs from, standard USDA grades or expectations. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Sam, and he's going to go into a little more detail on some of the problems that we tend to see with wheat when it delivers to the facility. He's going to go a little bit more in depth into mycotoxins and storage issues and some foreign material issues that we see from time to time.
Thank you, Abby. So generally, when we talk about mycotoxins, people are most familiar with the DON or vomitoxin. We're seeing more and more of the toxins being pulled in. Zearalenone is probably the number two that gets talked about. The cause of all of this is generally the same. It's fusarium in the wheat that leads the kernel to be infected with one or multiple different toxins. So that's something that's the driver of all of this, and that's generally what's being treated when people are using the fungicide is preventing that fusarium. It's known to be harmful to human, pets, and livestock. Varying degrees, you'll see limits. The U.S. limit is 1 ppm. You'll see that different with other jurisdictions going EU or Canada, and we'll cover that on another slide. It's a generally handled with testing on site. So most grain elevators are running some form of strip testing to accomplish this. That technology has changed throughout the years, starting to get more complicated with the different strip tests. Um, Different manufacturers have their own versions. Typically, it's when we talk about a strip test, you're going to be grinding and mixing solutions, placing test strips into those solutions, using the procedures, varying degrees or varying lengths of time that those stay in those solutions. Then they're going to be placed onto a reader, and it's going to be optically reading those strips and giving you a readout of the actual number, usually in ppm or ppb. That's the level that we're talking about here. Okay. So general mycotoxin limits by market. For human food, as I mentioned earlier, 1 ppm is the US limit. You'll actually see a higher limit in Canada, in the EU. Some of these other mycotoxins, the FDA hasn't actually set limits on them. So that's going to be driven primarily by customer specification, and you'll see that vary depending on the market. Some customers haven't caught up to some of the different toxins as of yet. So depending on the application, things like zearalenone, ochratoxin, aflatoxin may or may not come up. Pet food industry, you're looking at 1 to 2 ppm. Zearalenone, zearalenone received a little bit more attention in pet food, and that's usually 100 to 300 ppm or ppb. In livestock feed, you're looking at 5 ppm or lower is the specification, and zearalenone 300 to 500 ppb. Export markets, DON less than 1.5 ppm, zearalenone less than 100 ppb. Getting into what we actually see when we're grading the grain itself and what you may see when you harvest wheat that may have a mycotoxin problem. There's usually 3 different classifications when we're looking through a sample. There's going to be the healthy kernel. There's going to be white kernel, which has a couple of different shorthand terms that people will hear. So if you hear the term tombstone or desiccated, they're talking about the white kernel. And then you have the pink kernel that you'll see that pink hue, mostly on the tips, but it can vary depending on the level of the infection. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, depending on how bad the year is with mycotoxins, you can have readings even in the healthy kernel. But what really drives a high mycotoxin test is going to be those white desiccated kernels, because in the process of fusarium and the infection of the mycotoxins in the kernel, these are kernel that are actually killed by the fungus. So they'll become desiccated. We've done internal testing that tells us exactly how high some of these values can get. So in a given sample, you may test up to, say 7 ppm on the total sample. But when we go and we separate out the pink kernel and the desiccated kernel, you can see into the hundreds of ppm on the white kernel, and definitely into the upper single digits on the pink kernel. So that's what's really driving. So when you hear about different steps people take to control mycotoxin after it's been harvested, then you need to think about exactly what those processes are doing. Typically, what's happening is they're actually removing some of the desiccated kernel, and that's what's driving that reduction. They're not actually driving any reduction in the healthy kernel or the pink kernel for the most part. It's going to be on those highly infected kernel that we're seeing any difference. Fusarium infects the head during the wet flowering period. A corn-wheat rotation increases the risk, and the reason for that is that those are the crops most susceptible to mycotoxins. Beans are going to have less of an issue. Delayed harvest raises DON levels, so the longer they're in the field, mature, there's more risk of those DON levels rising. Toxins can be present even in clean looking grain. So there's years where you can go through and you won't see the pink, you won't necessarily see the desiccated kernel, but there's still going to be some level of infection. So mycotoxins in the field, choice of resistant varieties plays a factor. Fungicide, we've heard reports of that being very effective. So I think in 10 years ago, using fungicides for this was fairly uncommon. I think it's getting more and more common, and for the cost of the application and the complications with harvest and marketing, it's becoming probably a very good mitigation tool that most people should be considering. Um, being mindful, depending on the research that you want to listen to, there's varying opinions on whether no-till plays a factor. Field debris from corn and wheat causing those mycotoxins to be elevated, especially if you're following those up, and have a lot of field material still present when you're planting and harvesting other grains. So that's definitely a factor. Harvesting on time is important, as we talked about in the previous slide. Harvesting on time is going to help prevent any sprout damage. So when we get into some of the specific things that are tested in the food industry, that's important. So anyone that's familiar with a falling number, what that's actually measuring is the amount of sprout damage functionally. You're going to want to pay attention to broken kernel. That's a common thing. Anyone that's dealt with elevators will know that they'll grade on that. So getting your combine settings correct and minimizing kernel damage is important, especially in the food industry where they're going to pay closer attention to that. In the food industry, most processing plants are probably not going to have their own dryers, so maintaining moisture below 13.5% is important. The reason why that percentage is oftentimes used, roughly 13.5, sometimes 14, is because that's when microbial growth starts to become an issue. So depending on the plant, especially if it's a ready-to-eat plant, microbial pathogens are a huge issue. So that's something that's paid very close attention to. A standard elevator, you can bring grain in. Obviously, they're gonna dry it. They have dryers and everything, but a food processing plant oftentimes does not. Good storage practices, keeping it cool, dry, and clean, absolutely something that needs to be done, especially in the food application. You'll see later when we start talking about the actual grading that musty smells, coloration, all of that are things that food plants can and will grade and reject for. So typically an elevator might not be as stringent on those, but a food processing plant will be. It's going to be in your best interest if you do see poor quality to have some way of segregating those so that you have control of what inventory you're sending to what customer. So what you can control is choosing the right seed variety for your area and your application. You want to consider who you expect to be your customers, whether you're forward contracting, those types of things. Manage your fertility for the desired protein. So if you're dealing with a customer that or a contract that requires a higher protein, then you need to be making sure that you're doing the best you can with the fertility on that, or likewise potentially a lower protein number, because depending on applications, it could be requiring a higher or lower number of protein. Protecting against disease, especially the fusarium, is obviously a huge priority. You're going to want to store properly to preserve the quality. Know your end user specifications. Those can vary wildly compared to a standard grain elevator. So try to think about that ahead of time, because that's going to affect a lot of your practices leading up to that point in your business. Delivering wheat, quality inspections and testing. Uh, Grain originations portfolio for the Hudson facility. Commodities purchased: conventional wheat, organic, organic spelt, organic rye, and organic buckwheat. At the facility, we clean, dehull, mill whole flour, and mill refined white flour, as well as all the packaging lines. So it's kind of the entire process. We have a lot of different end users that take the various different products we produce. For those unfamiliar, we'll go into that later and exactly what the difference is between the flours and some of the different specifications. So quality assurance is something that we have to pay special attention to in a food facility. We're governed by GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative, and we're required to carry certifications for that. This involves an extensive program that we use to monitor the food safety. This is audited by third parties, including some of our customers. So in our case, we use the FSSC 22000, but food plants can use any of these different schemes that fall under the GFSI. Um, like I said, we are governed by FDA and Department of Agriculture standards, but generally, when you're under GFSI, you're more than accomplishing those standards. It's not unusual for us to see FDA inspectors yearly. We're generally being inspected, you know, uh, six six times a year between customers and the various regulatory authorities plus their certifiers. Being organic, we also receive organic inspections, not unlike what farmers would receive being organic, but typically it's a little bit more stringent because of our processing function, not to mention the number of commodities that we handle. The end result is we're trying to meet our customer specifications and provide the highest quality product at the end of the day. So, supplying to food grade processing facilities. Contracting with and delivery to food processing facilities, you need to understand the specifications, the requirements, and discounts associated. It's it's ever growing, the list of things that are being graded and inspected and the different specifications. Like I said earlier, this can be everything from quantifiable, where we get a number, to simply odor, coloration, those types of things. Being a food products, presentation is a huge factor, and especially when you're dealing in organics, the ability to manipulate some of the presentation factors are eliminated. So we can't bleach, we can't do some of the different things that a conventional product would be. So with organics, a lot of times these standards are higher than what you would see with other food products. So keep in mind that if you're going the value add route and supplying to the food industry, it's going to be different than your conventional elevator. When you're delivering organic products, a lot of times a processing facility is going to be a lot more stringent on making sure that your organic certification is in good standing and accurate, as well as a lot of times will require a U.S. Canadian equivalency due to the fact that a lot of the products are going to be marketed into Canada in a lot of cases. Um, there can be formal processes to be completed prior to deliveries, so pay attention to that as well. It's not uncommon to see new suppliers not understand or haven't not properly communicated to them that there are paperwork requirements that have to be completed prior to being received at a facility. So the most common is an organic certification that might not list a commodity or might be missing the US Canadian equivalency. Those might seem like very clerical and easy to fix issues, but from a processing facility standpoint, if there is a breakdown, if we were to receive grain where those are not updated yet and that ends up being an issue with that farmer, we dump that material into a container, it could have a huge impact, basically changing or a huge loss for the facility. So we tend to be very strict with those types of paperwork issues, they need to be resolved before the grains received at the facility. Representative sampling and testing before delivery when and where able. Not all facilities do this, but I think most processing facilities encourage this practice. So essentially, if you're harvesting, you have a lot of material that you intend to deliver to a facility, getting a representative sample and mailing that or delivering that to the facility ahead of time so that it can be tested to give you an idea about whether you're going to have an issue with a certain specification or not. It's in your best interest and the facility's best interest because nobody wants dead freight. And you'll see with a processing facility that risks are generally not taken, so you're going to see a higher level of rejection on different loads. This is partly because just from the end product quality, it's important, but it's also we get into regulations about what can and can't be done. So a standard elevator, there could be instances where they're blending for certain qualities. We're restricted on certain things on what we can and can't blend for. So it's maybe not as well known as it should be, but it's technically not legal to blend for toxin levels. So you can't, a facility should not be taking in higher toxin levels and blending that with lower toxin levels in order to achieve a specification. That's explicitly banned in the regulations. So all of that plays in. Trailer inspections. This is something that should be done, especially with organic product by the origin, by the farmer. So you're going to want to complete a clean truck certificate. This is often required at all organic facilities, but also a lot of food processing facilities. So you're going to be looking for breaches or holes in the trailer or tarp, loose material that could pose a foreign material concern, with a specific emphasis on glass, brittle, and plastics. Material on the rails or tarps, especially other grains and allergens. You'll find when you're delivering to these food facilities, if they're not handling soybeans or other high risk commodities like that, that if you have some soybeans or a meal on the rails that may look like soy or aren't easily identifiable, that it could be subject to rejection because allergens are a leading cause of food recalls and a lot of serious issues at these plants. So as discussed earlier, those clean truck certificates are most often required, and you're going to want to make sure that you're doing those inspections the best that you can to prevent there being an issue when it arrives on the scale, because every facility is going to be doing their own inspection of your trailer prior to unloading. So they're going to be going through everything. I would say best practices, if you're allowed to watch that inspection take place, that'll help you learn some of the different places that they're going to be looking on your trailer so that you can learn what they're looking at and how to keep your trailer as clean and avoid as many problems as possible. Sampling. All of these plants are going to be using a positive release testing regimen, meaning that all the tests have to be completed and cleared before unloading. This is going to oftentimes creates a longer wait time. Typically, especially if you're doing toxin testing, you can see anywhere from an extra 10 minutes all the way up to 30 or 40 minutes to complete those tests. So just know that when you're doing these value add contracts, that there's going to be some things that come up as far as wait times and just how things are scheduled. Oftentimes there's more stringent receiving schedules because product changeovers take a lot of time. There's a lot of factors that go into it. Also know that from the standpoint of the probing and sampling, it can be probed. It can also be tailgated. It's going to be monitored as it comes off the truck as well. So we're typically looking for instances where the trailer could be plugged or material that doesn't match the sampling can be found. We have to take those steps because any sort of allergen or foreign material could be a very serious thing from a food safety standpoint. Next, what is tested? So typically all the standard testing is going to be done. So foreign material, moisture, broken kernels, all the typical things that you would see at a grain elevator are going to be done. the next portion is we're going to be more stringent in looking through those foreign materials. So generally field materials, those are to be expected, but almost every facility, if glass, brittles, or plastic are found, that's going to be an automatic rejection. So you want to be very careful with that. And going back to the trailer inspections, when they're going around that trailer, if there's, cracked glass, plastic, anything on that trailer, those are things that people are trained to look for and identify. So be extra careful about that. I'll go into later why that is such a big deal at a processing plant. Next is pest activity. So we're going to be going through that FM and looking around the transportation vessel to make sure that we're finding any pest activity that might be present. Typically, that's subject to rejection, especially at an organic facility, because we have limited means to control that. A typical elevator, a conventional operation, they would be able to use fumigants. Obviously, we can't do that. So you'll see that being very strict. As I mentioned earlier, it's typical to inspect for coloration or odor as well. And this can quickly range into the foreign material. One of the common odor issues that come up is obviously mustiness or storage type issues, but you'll also find, especially dealing with organics, that you're going to have issues with volunteer weed type seeds that have an odor component to it. So wild garlic, wild onion are common problems that when it gets into the grain, that you can see rejections for that. It's something you don't have a lot of control of. Once it's in the grain, it's, if it fails one of the odor checks or something like that, it's really hard or impossible to remediate. And unfortunately, it's one of those things that's a little bit on the subjective side as well. So it's not something you can necessarily put a numeric value on. So it can be a real frustrating specification to meet. Other testing that's often conducted, if you're hauling into a mill, especially, falling number is always going to be taken. That's testing for the sprout damage. You'll see if anyone hasn't seen the photo to the right is what a typical falling number machine looks like. You can see it's a hot water bath with test tubes. And this rod in the middle is what the test is actually doing. Is once the solution is mixed, it's reading out how long it takes for that rod to fall through, and that's telling us how strong the gluten is. So a stronger gluten it's going to take longer for that test rod to drop through. Protein is sometimes tested at facilities, so that's almost always done with an NIR, near infrared spectrometry. And those are somewhat common at food facilities, though not everyone has one. Obviously, protein can be a frustrating specification in small grains, so you could see it come up. I don't have a photo of an NIR, but Dickie John does a lot of them. You'll see those at some of the higher end food facilities. They'll be testing every lot as it comes in. The last piece here is the mycotoxin testing. So below you find the 6 most common ones that are tested. We test those at our facility for some customers. The DON or vomitoxin is by and far the most common that's tested in the industry. And that's usually a pretty good indicator of any sort of mycotoxin issue. But in addition to that, you have fumonisin, zearalenone, ochratoxin, HT2 and T2, as well as aflatoxin. I will say that of these, even though DON gets the most attention, the aflatoxin is probably the most harmful of the 6. Aflatoxin has a carcinogenic property to it that the other ones are less likely to have. So that can be a big deal. Not so much in the wheat, but corn especially has more issues with aflatoxin. So when you hear that come up, just know that that's, whereas a DON issue is going to be, more of an immediate illness type issue, aflatoxin has far more serious health impacts. Going further into the foreign materials, what you need to know about this is these facilities are processing a product that's going to go on a consumer shelf. So we have certain, depending on the facility, there's going to be certain control methods for these different issues, depending on the property of the foreign material. So pest activity is obviously a microbial type issue, as well as damage to the kernel and other issues like that. An organic facility, there's an enhancement there too, because we have limited control means. You'll also see the emphasis on the glass, brittles, and plastic. And the reason for that is that we have very limited means to control for that. You can see, um, especially with glass, plastic, that it can have the same density and size because it can break at any size and have varying degrees of density that will match the kernel. So typical cleaning processes using aspiration, screens, sizing are rendered ineffective. Oftentimes, optical sorting is the most common way to control for these, but by that same token, depending on the material, it could actually have the same color profile. So not all of that material can even be removed with optical sorting. So that's the reason why those are highlighted as the most serious. Obviously, any foreign material is negative, but when you talk about metal, there's a lot of control means from magnets to metal detection that are used at these plants. So obviously, we don't want to see it, but there are ways that facilities are actively controlling that. Some of these other foreign materials are far more difficult to handle. So most of our control means are preventing it from getting into the plant from the beginning. And that's why you'll see so much time spent on inspections, why your samples looks like they're going through it with a fine-tooth comb, because we're trying to find any sort of foreign material that could pose a serious problem later on. Going into the actual processing of the material, cleaning is removing the field foreign material as well as other safeguards for non-field material, typically using sizing, aspiration, optical sorting in some instances. In our specific plant, we also do dehulling, so removing the hull or the husk from a given grain, depending on what we're handling. So we have specialized equipment that's used to accomplish that goal. Then going into the milling, whole flour is going to be the entire grain, including the bran, milled, ground up, and put through the process. Refined flour is actually using rollers and sifting screens to break down the kernel to get to remove the bran and get down to the endosperm. So in summary, soft red wheat is heavily utilized in food, feed, and pet markets. Mycotoxins, especially DON and Z, are major quality risks from a toxin standpoint. Buyers want clean, uniform, and safe wheat. You influence the quality through the variety of seed that you use, the timing, fertility, and harvest, as well as storage. An emphasis on prevention is more effective than mitigation. You want to catch the problems before they reach the plant. It's something it's something plants are trained to recognize. So it's just human nature. But if you have rejections at a certain plant, you're probably gonna get a higher level of scrutiny on subsequent loads. So, like I said, sending samples up ahead, um, taking those precautions to prevent the product from reaching the scale or the receiving portion of the process is in everyone's best interests. Um, and try to learn the process in the facility. There's going to always be slightly different procedures, expectations, and specifications. And having a good relationship with your buyer is going to help you navigate that whole process. Um, a lot of food facilities should be very open about their processes to try to impress upon you what you can do to deliver a product that's within specification. So that's what we have. If anyone has any questions, here's our contact information as well at the end of this presentation, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So appreciate everybody's time.
All right, thank you, both of you, Abby and Samuel. It was a very good presentation, very knowledgeable, and everything. Do you have some questions here? First off, how do you balance the need for a fungicide application with the ask for pesticide-free or low input products?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this one first and then Sam chime in on anything additional that's going through your mind. But it's a really good question, first of all, because it is something that can be kind of at odds with each other when we're talking to farmers and end users. I mean, I think one thing we try to do as somewhat of the middleman or the processor is educate our buyers because a lot of times we're talking to consumer packaged goods companies, CPG brands, and there are varying levels of understanding in terms of what is actually happening on the farm to get the quality product that they're looking for. So I think part of it comes down to us advocating for you all and making sure that they understand that sometimes the things they're asking for are being achieved with methods that may be less than ideal for them. So, you know, when we're talking specifically about like fungicide application, and then them wanting low toxins and low input pesticide free, chemical free products, we're having that conversation where we're letting them know that it can be difficult to achieve some of those things in certain years without those tools in our tool belts. But I also think this kind of comes back to understanding your buyers and your end use markets because it also kind of depends on you as a grower, your risk appetite. So if there's a premium available because you're producing a chemical free product, but you're also expected to meet a low toxin spec, that's obviously more risk on the table for you. And so, um, making that decision in terms of what you're willing to take on in terms of risk is going to be very important. And then, also just recognizing a farmer can do everything right as we've outlined in this presentation, and there can still be this big wild card called weather that just doesn't allow for those specifications to be met. So, because one of the other things sometimes buyers ask for are like single source or locally sourced products, which we absolutely want to do. I mean, usually that's more economical and cost effective, but it's also important for us to maintain relationships that are a little bit broader in terms of geography because a lot of these issues, particularly with toxins, come up in concentrated geographic areas where if we see an issue pop up, a lot of times it's pretty widespread, not just on one farm.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, it's kind of as we deal with seed here, I don't really seed. It's we deal with the issue on the seed quality standards and stuff. Yeah, on that. So, but yeah, and then so we have another question here. Josh, he has two questions to do with grain storage. First, how dry would wheat need to be to store it in airtight tote bags like those 2,000-pound poly totes? And could grain ferment if I replace the oxygen in the airtight with CO2?
Okay, I'll take a stab at these. First, generally, you're going to want to try to store grain at around 13%. That's where most people are aiming for. The issue with the tote bags is that they're certainly not. I mean, when I hear tote bags, I tend to think the poly bags, which are typically not airtight. But when you think about those types of containers, you need to think about the potential for them to condense sweat. We see that with some of our products when we have a difference in temperature, especially in a small container like that. You can see the material build up moisture on the outside. So that's generally something you want to avoid. Larger containers where you can aerate is always going to be a better means to store grain. So, a grain bin with a good aeration floor and being able to manipulate that temperature, especially to minimize that risk, is going to be important. To the second question, could grain ferment if I place oxygen in an airtight tote with CO2? If you're removing the CO2 and your moisture is correct, I don't think that would be a major concern. To get fermentation, I think you need moisture high enough. And typically, I mean, in the organic industry, CO2 is used to control for insects in some applications. So it's very common to pump CO2 into airtight containers with grain, and I've never heard of a quality issue arising from that.
That's good to hear. Thank you. Another one from Mark Howard. Is FW Scott? Sorry, geez. FW stock still in operation in Hillsdale? And do you deal with Chelsea Milling? And he just wants to say he sold his first little organic wheat back in 1976.
Yes, the old FW stock operation is familiar to this location specifically. This was one of the locations that would haul into that mill. That hasn't been in operation for a good 20 plus years. Part of that is actually leased out for a different application. If anyone's if anyone's a hunter and may have seen Lucky Buck, that product that's used, actually that's the operation that's moved into the footprint of that old mill. Last one of the last operators of it, I think Star of the West. Don't quote me on that, but it changed hands a lot of times towards the end of its lifespan. But yes, this location, not the Andersons as an entity through this location, but previous owners dealt heavily with that. This was actually a satellite to that. They would store some of the grain here before they brought it in. So there was a close working relationship. As far as Chelsea Milling, no, we don't do any active business with them, but we're very aware of them, along with Jiffy and some of the local milling operations. This is a pretty concentrated area as far as food packaging and processors between Star, the West, and obviously going out to the west of the state with Kellogg and General Mills and various things like that. But Abby might be able to give a little bit more color to this.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say we don't deal with them directly out of Hudson, but as a company, I would bet that we do. There's also the Michigan Millers Association, also is a pretty tight knit group, which we're both members of. So I know there's good representation in that organization from both companies.
All right, thank you. I guess, and then I was gonna think, what's one thing you wished you wish kind of when people are starting to get into soft red or soft wheat, I should say. What's one thing that they should do before taking that plunge?
I I'll let Abby go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just make two comments and then you can go, Sam. I mean, I think that's a lot of what we covered in this presentation is just talking with other people in your supply chain. So talk to your seed supplier, make sure that they're helping you select the seed that's going to be most advantageous for your operation. Talk to your agronomist, really understand what your nutrition and fertility program should look like, and then talk to your buyer. And not just understanding the specs, but get to know them because I think the better relationship you have there, the more flexible they're going to be in trying to troubleshoot and work through various issues.
Yeah, and I'll also say, especially when you're talking about small grains, some of the biggest quality issues we've seen throughout the years have been related to mycotoxin and understanding how susceptible you are to those types of infections in your crop. There's you can look at different various maps. I know Neogen used to do a really good map that shows the prevalence of mycotoxins based on your region. Obviously, so your practices play into that, but if you're in what's called the mycotoxin belt, you can do everything perfectly and still have issues. So there's a strip of land, and I should have had that on the slide, but it's basically kind of central Ohio, stretching down through central Indiana in a big belt that runs across there. The reason for that has to do with climate and the soil, but that is some of the highest risk areas when it comes to mycotoxins. So when you see some of the small wheat and some of the reason why it's more usually pushed up further north, mycotoxins are part of the reason for that. Even in our immediate area, it's wheat's not as popular as it used to be. So it's being pushed further north as climate tends to change. So the positioning of that high risk belt can potentially change depending on year and depending on climatic concerns. But it's something I would do research in before I would commit a large percentage of my acreage. I'd try to get a hold of some of those maps, even talk to your neighbors who may be doing it and understanding what they typically see, because every region is going to be a little bit different.
And I think too, like if you're planning on selling to a buyer that does have a more stringent specification, ask those questions like, what is the contingency plan if your load shows up, or if you have a high toxin year or a low falling number year? How are they willing to help you find another market? What does that look like so you're not left high and dry, and that they're a partner in working through those issues?
All right, you got one more here. Just about any specific seed variety coming on the forefront that you as millers are looking forward to seeing?
We have very specific seed varieties that we look for when it comes to spelt. We do not have specific identified varieties when it comes to soft red wheat, but I know there's probably some people on this call that could answer that question better than I could.
Yeah, and obviously the specific application to the processing plant will matter. So whether you're hauling into a genuine mill where they're milling it into flour, or uh, a, a facility who might be doing other processes and putting that into different industry or different specific products other than a flour product, that's going to change fairly significantly.
And then we got Margaret here. She chimed in on what spelt varieties you're looking for. That kind of piqued her interest there.
Yeah. So we right now would be looking for Obercomer, Maverick, or Sun Gold for the most part. There are a number of other varieties that do pretty well in a food application. We don't have as extensive research or data on those, so typically we like to see samples and we may do some extra testing on those. But we'll consider everything but known feed grade varieties pretty much.
Yeah, and I will say Sammy was one of the ones that also fell into that bucket before, but much like Overcomer, it's getting really hard to get a hold of.
Yeah, that's kind of seems to be the thing with some of these specialty grains that seed stock isn't as readily available as some of the other more popular ones. But
Yeah, and I
yeah,
should mention too, I know Albert Lee has a couple of varieties that we're looking into at the moment too, because I think especially with Sammy and Obercomer being harder to come by, like we are looking to add some other varieties to the mix that we know will perform well in a baking application.